So Grinding Gear Games recently held a very long live stream revealing a ton of new information for Path of Exile 2's early access release, which is coming on December 6th. Now this live stream was over an hour of just pure gameplay with one of the developers narrating it, and then they also had a very long Q&A after that, so there was a ridiculous amount of new information for this game, including a ton of really interesting endgame content. So the main thing I wanted to go over in this video is my general thoughts on a lot of this information as being mainly a Diablo 4 player, at least for ARPGs, and as being someone who has played a little bit of Path of Exile. I played Path of Exile when it was first in paid beta. I played a couple times over the years, not a ton of playtime in the game, but I've also watched a lot more content on Path of Exile 1 than I've actually played the game, so I have a little bit of knowledge on the game and some of these endgame systems, but I'm generally going into this as a noob in Path of Exile 1, looking at all of this stuff coming to Path of Exile 2, at least in its early access launch. Now the starting portion and a big chunk of this overall stream was pretty heavily focused on the different classes and all the different customization and elements you can build around different pieces of all of the classes, and then later going into all their ascensions and just being focused around that second to second gameplay and the class options and customization. And this is the thing that originally made me excited for Path of Exile 2 as somebody that's tried Path of Exile 1 but really didn't stick with it. And the primary reason I didn't stick with Path of Exile 1 was because of the feel of the second to second combat and how that game played, but I'm much more interested in Path of Exile 2's general combat. The Path of Exile 2 combat is being designed much more around being slower, more tactical gameplay, not being built around just teleporting around a map, constantly destroying millions of enemies as you go, and just being super fast gameplay. Path of Exile 2 is definitely being built more on that slower pace of combat, generally less enemies on the screen, with every enemy being much more important, and also seeming to just have a lot more weight in combat. Like a lot of the abilities just seem to have much more weight. You kind of feel the use of the abilities a lot more. And this is also another reason why I like Diablo 4 so much, is because that's kind of the general focus of the combat. Have it be a bit slower, a bit more methodical, and have the feel of all of the abilities you're using. And I've always been interested in the systems of Path of Exile 1, which Path of Exile 2 is also using a lot of those systems, but I just didn't like the combat enough to spend the hundreds and hundreds of hours you need to have a base understanding of PoE 1, but PoE 2 still having a lot of that complexity and interesting systems while having a combat system that I much more like has definitely just made Path of Exile 2 a game I am much more interested in. Now, outside of the combat design, the other thing I was most interested in from this live stream is just the sheer amount of endgame being added in PoE 2 on early access. Now, a lot of this endgame content was stuff that was present in Path of Exile 1 as well. Just there obviously having all the new creatures and enemies you face, the new bosses, and then also giving you new rewards. But that kind of base actual content you're partaking in is a lot of stuff that was from Path of Exile 1, which I think is actually going to just help this game out. I don't think there's going to be a downside. The only downside I could really see with reusing or retooling a lot of the endgame stuff from Path of Exile 1 is that maybe some of the players from Path of Exile 1 will feel like they're just reusing content, but I feel like the vast majority of Path of Exile 1 players already like that stuff, so they'll like that it's in Path of Exile 2. And if you're someone that didn't really play a lot of Path of Exile 1, all of this content is just new anyway, so this is just going to allow Path of Exile 2 to easily have the most endgame content of any ARPG on release. And they even had a portion of the live stream talking about this as they took pretty much all of their development and put it into the endgame for early access launch. Now, a side effect of this is how you're going to progress throughout the game getting into the endgame, because on early access launch, there's only going to be acts 1, 2, and 3. And going through those, say your first time, they say will take around 25 hours, will probably take a lot less if you're a player that's played Path of Exile 1 or just a player of like ARPGs or RPGs in general. It'll probably take less time than that. After you do Act 1, 2, and 3, you're then going to redo Act 1, 2, and 3 in cruel difficulty, basically just being a harder version of it. Now, this is one of the areas that I really am not a fan of how it's going to be on early access launch. Now, keep in mind when the game is fully launched, there'll be Acts 4, 5, and 6, which will make a lot more sense than redoing all 3 acts right after you just redid them. This is just something I'm not really a fan of. Doing the campaign game, then instantly redoing it again instead of going into newer systems or going into the end game. But once you do that and you're at about level 65, you'll get into the end game, which will take you all the way up to level 100. And that'll be a very large portion of the game and will also be what most people are really interested in. Now, after you get past all those acts and you're into the end game, this is where a lot of the very interesting things are. And first off, their kind of foundation for the end game is kind of reminiscent of some old school RPGs or even some old school RTSs. And it's also kind of reminiscent of the Monolith system in Last Epoch. But basically, they have this massive infinite map, which is where all of the end game exists on. So you have this massive map with all of these different markers and locations where you need to use these waystone items to enter any of these different areas. And all of the endgame systems are going to be within this map. So this map is kind of just you traversing throughout all of the different pieces of the endgame. So there'll be bosses located on some, there'll be some random events of like shrines or different loot chests on all of these different maps. There'll be different affixes. You can get higher tiers of these waystones, which are basically just like maps from Path of Exile 1, where you can have different augments or effects or different loot amounts or difficulties. And I do think it is really interesting that they have this like overarching atlas map that all of the endgame is located on and all of the different endgame systems are located in, and then you can just travel around the map how you want. It's a really interesting way to have everything kind of within the same system, but have the variation of the actual content you're doing be pretty massive. And there's all the different aspects you would kind of expect, where you can choose different paths to go in whichever direction you want. If there's like a boss over there you want to fight, or there's some event over there you want to do, then they even have things like these big towers that you go into, and once you complete the encounter at this tower, it reveals a much larger area. And this whole endgame atlas map is also going to be heavily randomized of all of the content that they've made for the game. So there's going to be all the different biomes, all the different creatures and enemy types, all the different bosses from the campaign reused in different areas, but with obviously higher difficulty and different abilities. And it's almost just like this really interesting board game that takes you to all of the endgame content. So I'm definitely a fan of how they've laid out all of the endgame. Now, when it gets really crazy is all of the different endgame systems that are present within the Atlas map. So just to quickly go through everything that's going to be in the early access version of Path of Exile 2's launch, starts with the Trials of Ascension, which these aren't only endgame content, but they both scale into the endgame. So the Trial of the Sechemus and the Trial of Chaos. And there will also be a third piece of content specific to Ascensions that will also be scaling into the endgame. Then you just have a long list of additional endgame content. You have breaches, you have expeditions, you have rituals, you have delirium, and then you have pinnacle bosses. And all of those systems of endgame content all have like their own rewards. They all have their own progression skill trees, because that's also something pretty big in Path of Exile and 2. Any piece of endgame content you do has its own talent or skill tree where you do that content, you get points to then put into the trees to then buff up or augment pieces of that endgame content. So if you're someone that really likes doing breaches, you could continue to just progress the breach skill tree. But outside of those skill trees, all of this endgame content has their own rewards, has all their different pieces of content to go do. And all of this is present in the Atlas map and is all going to be in the game on the early access launch. And not only that, but the developers also said this is half of the endgame content of the game. So going from December 6th to whenever the game is fully released, they'll basically be doubling the content of the game, which more importantly, they'll be doubling the endgame content, which is kind of absurd. And while this is super interesting, especially for someone like me that's played RPGs for 20-25 years at this point, it can also be extremely daunting for newer players, especially to PoE or ARPGs or RPGs in general. It'll be a very daunting piece of the game, but that's also what makes it just super interesting and fun. So as somebody that didn't put much time at all into Path of Exile 1, I'm very excited for Path of Exile 2. I think it's doing a lot more things I like. Like I mentioned, I think the combat was one of the main things I didn't like about Path of Exile 1, but I think the Path of Exile 2 combat and how they're going about designing just the general second to second, minute to minute gameplay is something I am very interested interested in, but then they're also keeping that super complex endgame that they had in Path of Exile 1, which was the part of Path of Exile 1 that I was super interested in. So I, for one, am very excited for the early access launch and to jump into a game that is super complicated, but will just be very fun to figure out. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.